But jumping ahead, because you're here to talk about, or you're here to hear me talk about the Herald, I'm going to start with my first exhibit, which is a film. I won't linger too long on the case. It's a film called Defence of the Realm, which came out in 1986, which is the time when I was training at the Herald. And it was quite an influential film for journalists of that time. It's a British film. At first, when you watch it, you feel it's perhaps got Stratford echoes, because it's talking about an MP who's forced to resign after he's spotted leaving a building, and then an East German attaché is seen leaving the building, and you think, oh, where are we going with this? It feels like we've got echoes of Profumo, but it very quickly changes into a different kind of tale. But I think those of us who are training in Stratford and elsewhere found it a very inspirational film in terms of why did we want to be journalists. It's a bit of a ripping yarn, as you know, probably the sort of thing that now turns up on Talking Pictures TV, if any of you have ever spent time with that. But as I moved on in the career and became an editor, I started to use it as an alternative element to the training that would be offered to journalists, because I said, yes, you can do the training, you can learn law, you can study central local government, but this gets to the passion of it. And I think the passion is an all part of why we do it. And so occasionally it would be on television, and eventually I got hold of the DVD copy, and it's quite something when I lent it to a new trainee reporter and said, take this home, have a look at this, and this will show you why we're journalists. And yes, it's a film, there's compromises, but there's a lot to it. Yet when Annette, as she was called, came in the next day, the one thing she said to me was, she said, yes, but Richard, they were using typewriters. And it just showed how quickly things had moved on at that point. This was 1995, and already she couldn't believe that we'd ever produce newspapers working with such primitive technology as the typewriter. But of course, that's very much what the world was. And by 1995, really, the move away from typewriters was only probably just complete, and was certainly part of my original time at Herald. But actually, my connection with the Herald goes back slightly before my start as a trainee reporter, when I was a midweek delivery boy to begin with. And being on Bridgetown, I managed to pick up a round that was in that area. But for people on Bridgetown, it's what we call the other side of Banbury Road. So it was Dale Avenue and places like that. And I was trusted to deliver in the midweek, but with the threat that the managing director, Peter Naylor, lived on Dale Avenue, and miss his house out at your peril was really the message. Now, it wasn't really my inclination to throw papers in the hedge, although I realised later on in my career that was quite a common occurrence, and we had to take a variety of countermeasures to, if we couldn't stop them going in hedges, was to track down who'd thrown them in the hedges. So not so many free newspapers around now, but if you ever come across them, you might often find just very subtle colour marking on the spine, which we always believed the delivery people wouldn't know was there. But actually, if a bundle was found, or if somebody phoned in to report they'd found a bundle, we could pretty quickly identify who'd decided to drop them off rather than deliver them. So yes, that's where I started. And so I knew the name Peter Naylor. Some of you around the room might well know Peter Naylor from various times in the past. And he was my first awareness of the Herald management, until back from university and back in Stratford, I applied for a job at the Herald. Curiously, as I prepared for this, I realised that 37 years ago this evening, I was playing as part of a very poor band, shall I call rock band, we were playing our first gig at an interesting place, which was then called Ufcombe Clinic in Birmingham, a place built by the Cadbury family as a home, but then became part of the psychiatric health services run by Birmingham, but actually was a place that Stratford people would go to for a variety of sort of residential treatment. And through that connection, my band, as it was, played their first gig there. We got back to Stratford and wanted to sit up all night talking about our first gig, but I didn't stay because I had my Herald interview the next morning. So I went home and got ready for an 11 o'clock interview. I got called in at 2 minutes past 11, and 8 minutes later I was back out in Rother Street, having had 2 interviews. Tempting to say not a lot happened in there, but quite a key point was that Peter Naylor was one of the 2 people who interviewed me, and one of his questions was a sports question, which I wasn't expecting, but was able to deal with. But at that point, this was because the Herald didn't employ a full-time sports editor, so the trainee reporters did it in turn. And in the world we lived in then, they only tended to employ men because it was believed only men could do sports. So at that time, there was a dearth of women reporters being taken on. But by the September, I started, and I was an indentured reporter. So yes, essentially an apprentice. I committed to working to the Herald for a number of years, and they would fund my training, which was done on the job, but then with a block release training to what's called the National Council for Training of Journalists. And this, of course, meant I started at Rother Street, a building again, although recently the Herald's moved out of it, a very familiar building to many people. Many of you may have been into the front office at Rother Street and met the different generations of the advertising team based there. But it was a huge building. It goes right the way back into the Greenhill Street car park. So if you go into the Greenhill Street car park by Foster Frames, you'd come to essentially the back of the Herald building, which went a long way back. Quite a rabbit warren in there, but also with very big spaces. Now, at the time I went, the newspaper wasn't being printed on site, but theatre programmes and other brochures were still printed there. So alongside the newspaper departments of editorial, advertising and accounts, there was also a team of printers working there. So there's quite a lot of print activity in that site. You had, Foxes, if you like, over the other side of the road with an operation there, and then the Herald with a specialist print operation as well. But indulging in all the sort of the print activities that, again, was part of the industry. Again, people apprenticed there. There was a sort of a coming out process when people completed their apprenticeships. There was some tradition that people were, had large amounts of printer's ink thrown over them, and strange customs that dated back to long ago in the print industry. In the building, it was no longer hot metal, although hot metal lasted till about this time in the national press, where it was much more unionised. The papers were actually put together, in the next step beyond hot metal. So there was a whole composing room where the compositors were working with essentially what we call bromide. Stories were run out as strips of bromide and then cut and pasted onto full-size equivalents of the pages. They were then sent away, and they were then photographed and used to make up the plates to produce the papers. Now, in our department, as I already said, we were working on typewriters, and it was a wonderful environment. And if any of you, again, have worked in that kind of situation, you know, a room with lots of typewriters, there was just a natural atmosphere because of the hammering of the keys and the hitting of the return carriage. Our particular style was to write stories, and always you submitted a story to go through the editing process, but you always kept a copy of it. So these were the days when carbon paper was still a vital ingredient to the office. We tended to write on small sheets of paper so that if you made a mistake, you didn't have to destroy the whole thing. So here's an original, don't attempt to read it, it's only one of my reviews of a Kyneton Amateur Dramatic Society play from some 1985, I think. But you did it so a story would then run over a lot of separate sheets. So, you know, this, just as a theatre review, is about, you know, 10 small sheets of paper, but that was seen as the best way. So you took a copy, you kept a copy in what we call the dead copy basket. This was called a black, and you save those up as backup. So yes, if you've looked at the page mentioned this evening, you'll see that Tipp-Ex was another important part of the equipment, and being able to keep the immaculate Tipp-Ex in the office was quite an achievement. You know, if somebody took your Tipp-Ex and left the top off and it all dried up, that would be a source of great tension in the newsroom. But we, you know, despite the belief of my colleague, barely 10 years later, we produced newspapers happily and successfully on typewriters. Mentioned before, again, you know, shorthand came along and possibly saved me from bad handwriting. And although most of the training was done by block release, in my case, in the Herald's case, we had a tradition that Herald trainees went down to Portsmouth for training. That was sort of a 10-week block release funded by the paper. But the one thing that was done close at home and remains a key skill is that we learned shorthand. So we were taught by somebody, a former lecturer at Stratford College, and went for hourly lessons to learn shorthand, and then eventually went to the college where still secretarial was a huge sort of department, and hopefully we got certificates and learned our speed up to the target, which was 100 words a minute. Now, it's generally reckoned that people will talk about 180 words a minute or more, but it's deemed 100 words is enough for a journalist to be able to get quotes down, and specialist shorthand writers will use Pitman rather than journalists learning T-line, and will write at much faster speeds. But it was an important part of the job. Whatever personal shorthand we might have developed as a student or writing notes in other situations, shorthand really sort of unlocks the ability to cover meetings, go down to court, or whatever we were asked to do, and remains in law, newspaper law today. It remains a great defence to a challenge of any stories you've done, that if you've got a contemporaneous shorthand note of the conversation, that still has a solid basis in law when you may be challenged over a story. So rather than stick too much with the chronology, I'll try and pick out a few themes maybe about that time and the type of stories we did. And a huge part of our daily life, really, which is now not part of a Herald reporter now, is that, yes, very easy from the Herald, we would walk up the road each morning for police call, and this would be where we'd go to the police station, we'd meet one of the inspectors, and the inspector would go through a big folder and we'd flick through the pages and discuss whether any incidents that had happened overnight would be something of interest to the paper. And this might be significant things happening in the town, But I can remember, we picked up some really good stories from something very topical still, bike thefts. But obviously now you won't see bicycle thefts reported by the police. In those days, you'd sit in a room at the police station, the inspector would go, "Oh, this one could be interesting. I think that was a birthday present." And you go, "All right." And they'd happily give you the telephone number, you'd ring the family up, and you could have a great story from that. And one of the frustrations as a journalist is, whatever the requirements of privacy GDPR, is that we've lost access to a lot of the information that was of interest to people, wasn't scaremongering, but gave a reflection of what was happening in the town. So that was usually a first job of the morning, and then another one that was a key part of the role as a trainee reporter was to go to cover Magistrates Court, which again was a walk along Rother Street, and attend Magistrates Court. Now, again, for debate by people wiser than myself, Magistrates Court at the time, police were doing the prosecutions, and these were the sort of the smaller cases, speeding and things like that. And you could go down to Magistrates Court between 10 o'clock in the morning, come back for lunch at 1 o'clock when court broke, and you probably had 3-4 stories in your notebook at that point. And again, undeniably, people like to know what's happening in the court, and reporting of stories. Obviously, even then, the bigger stories would go off to Crown Court. But obviously Stratford had its Magistrates Court, which was quite busy, and Ulster also had a Magistrates Court that we used to attend for the Herald. So often on a Monday morning, I would make the journey over to Ulster to cover Ulster Magistrates, which didn't sit as often, but it did sit on a Monday. The only downside to that was that if you happened to appear in Ulster Magistrates Court on a Monday, you did have a disproportionate chance of being the front page story on the midweek news the next day. But beyond that, obviously what's changed in the town, the police station is not, operating the way it did back then, and obviously the Magistrates Court is closed, and essentially everything takes place over at the Justice Centre in Leamington. Now, there's various issues around that. Before actually the Magistrates Court closed, there was a change from Magistrates Court's cases being prosecuted by the police. There was a move to the Crown Prosecution Service, its invention and then its introduction, as a way to remove the police from prosecuting the people that investigated. Now that was something that immediately saw quite a change in newspaper coverage of the courts. Whereas I could describe that situation where I'd walk along Rother Street and in 3 hours come back to the office with probably 4 stories. The Crown Prosecution Service operated in a very different way, and it meant there were lots of cases adjourned and relisted, and it became a challenge for newspapers to continue covering the courts, because essentially, although we can look back on the 80s as a relatively golden time for the newspapers, we still didn't have limitless numbers. So if you went out for 3 hours and used to get 4 stories, and you now went out for 3 hours and came back with nothing because everything had been adjourned or documents hadn't arrived, you can quickly see a pressure when newspapers stopped covering these kinds of cases, and so magistrates' coverage was reduced even before the courts were closed and centralised. Nowadays, there is still court coverage. You'll see, in the Herald, in other papers, but typically that's where a freelance covers the cases over at Leamington and then follows those he thinks are of interest and sells them to the papers around. So most of the court cases now that would appear in the Herald will be supplied by a freelance who, yes, at the Herald we would perhaps say, could you follow a specific case? But otherwise it would be him looking at the lists and deciding to follow essentially what he thinks he's got most chance of selling to the Herald and to the other media around. So again, a debate for another time, but certainly something that has changed in terms of the reporting. And although not so serious for Stratford when there's other significant institutions like the RSC, like the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, but in other places, there is a civic identity that can be diminished when things like the courts disappear. I've worked elsewhere where you can see instantly if the magistrates' court's taken away, law firms move away, and it slightly diminishes the presence in the town. So Stratford has lost something of that, but perhaps unlike a number of places has got other sort of civic identity still firmly in place. I see we've got a couple of our councillors on the call. I mean, perhaps looking ahead, one wonders the current move for merger between Stratford and Warwick. If Stratford District Council becomes part of a body which is no longer based in the town, that would be another part of the process that I've seen happen. With the courts, that we might lose something from the obvious number of people who might be working in the town centre to just a sense of focus for other things when one of these institutions is no longer there. But that was something that sort of was the heart of what we were doing, but also even without that regular coverage, obviously we continue to put out newspapers covering stories in a different way. I've mentioned the council, and obviously council meetings remain a vital part of that coverage. Again, if you look at the 80s into the 90s, we probably still went out and covered parish councils, the town councils, more than happens now. Again, I think it's blessed in Stratford that there is a significant town council in Stratford, but again elsewhere, very much the case that as staffing is reduced, the smaller town or the parish councils are not covered in the way they were. So just as I waved about a Kyneton Amateur Dramatic Society review, so we would head out to parish councils on a regular basis. There was no particular rules on how many night jobs we would do in a week, but the compensation was we finished at Friday lunchtimes, and without trying to make our lives sound too exciting, it's fair to say that at 1 o'clock on a Friday, a large number of people crossed the road to the Seven Stars and unwound and discussed the week in the Seven Stars, which became the Lamplighter, and is obviously now the Coach House. So there was a hint of newspaper culture as it might have been in the past. But as I say, that was at a time when the Herald had a good many people working there. Now, obviously, at that time, the Stratford Herald was, as I believe it remains now, the dominant paper in the town. But it wasn't alone. The Evesham Journal had a presence in the town. You may remember it had that office essentially on the corner of Greenhill Street and Grove Road. The Birmingham Post and Mail, Coventry Telegraph had people in town at different times. And of course, we also had the Y magazine, which again, if you remember the Y magazine, that had come along and done something quite different but equally quite distinctive. You know, by basically pulling together the classified advertising and coming out on a Sunday morning, it did something quite different, and it wasn't produced to newspaper standards. Basically, if they had a space, they just duplicated adverts until they filled it. But it was well read and well loved, and legend has it that in the early days, the Herald had the chance to buy it. It came out of Ulster originally, but the Herald didn't see it as any kind of risk and didn't buy. It grew and became quite widespread, covering not just South Warwickshire, but spreading out Warwickshire and towards Solihull and Coventry. So, you know, there was other media around, there was competition, so the Herald didn't sit even then in, you know, in splendid isolation. But obviously, as we move forward, one of the quirks of, you know, of my career that I must confess in talking about the Herald is that, having moved, I was the editor who launched the Stratford Observer, and that was in May 1989. Now, it wasn't motivated by this, but my chief reporter at the time, who is a name, again, some of you will remember, Betty Smith, who worked for the Herald, worked on the Focus magazine, wrote a number of books that you can still find, you know, in the Shakespeare Hospis's bookshop or on the shelves online. A big fan of the history of this area in particular, but also around Warwickshire. As part of the newsroom at the Herald, she'd always said nobody could ever launch a newspaper successfully directly against the Herald. So the Observer was the first paper that came out. I ran it for a year, and then in recent memory, it's the only paper that's come out as a Stratford paper that has hung around. And although perhaps it's not as Stratford focused as it once was, and is now the Stratford and Evesham Observer, it has been going now just over 32 years. So in a way, has got a contribution to play in terms of recording something of the history. And it also had a sufficient impact when it launched that the Herald, retaining all the estate agents, which was seen as a huge part of the business, but was still sufficiently rattled that they decided to make changes, and went off and recruited somebody that many of you will know, and that was Chris Towner, who was then at the Banbury Guardian and was recruited to come and take on the Stratford Herald. So that sort of dates back to that time. But even with you know, the Observer then being in place, you know, really the 90s, well into the 2000s, was a golden era, you know, for the Herald. Being family owned and independent, yeah, it did very well. It retained that core business, as I've said, the property market, which was always seen as so important, especially again in Stratford, and really came through into a new century in good health. Yes, the town around it changed. You know, I will join, for those of you on the Stratford Then and Now forum on Facebook, I will join with others and lament, you know, the shots we've lost, whether it's R.H. Bailey, you know, always seems to crop up, which has always been called Tinker Bailey, whether it's Midland Educational, whether it's Pargeters. I've still got found the other day, I've still got my Pargeters paper bag, which I kept as a souvenir when, you know, they were celebrating an anniversary and printed up special paper bags. Yes, there's all those things to lament, but, you know, the Herald has stayed there throughout it all. The town is, I still feel, is a wonderful place. And as I say, the Herald through it all remained profitable, but even as the Herald, couldn't escape what was going on in the rest of the industry. And as I moved around and worked in other places, but still, keeping that passionate connection with Stratford. Undeniably, whatever else was happening, the internet had arrived, and a huge issue for newspapers was not simply the fact of the internet. It was, again, the fact that in the wider industry, newspapers were so profitable that they didn't respond quickly enough. I can remember sat in, I don't know if any of you remember going into Moore Street Station, and you could see what was the Birmingham Post and Mail Tower with a clock on. It was always a bit of a landmark as you went in from Stratford on the train. And I was sat in a meeting there. It was a regional editors meeting, and the regional editorial director for that Post and Mail group, the discussion came up about websites, and he actually did utter the words that I don't think this internet is going to be a very big thing. And that was an issue for newspapers generally. If you think about it, I've mentioned property several times. Newspapers should have got together and developed internet for property, but no, Rightmove did it, which had no connection with newspapers, and these sort of things took away a lot of the business from newspapers. Again, if you go back through the Heralds of not many years ago, you'll see the recruitment section, the job section was a hugely important thing. When you look at something like the Evening Mail in Birmingham, as that started to decline, that was, you really were talking telephone numbers in terms of the lost revenue for that, because people found other ways of advertising for jobs, whereas probably the Birmingham Mail, Coventry Telegraph, if Thursday was their jobs day, that was probably their best-selling paper of the week, and also the one that made them the most money, because different rates were charged for different kinds of adverts, and recruitment was the big earner. But having returned to the Herald on a couple of times, I came back in late 2018, and mindful of the clock and the need to allow questions, I'm going to jump to my most recent stint with Herald. I've been back before that, but I came back in 2018 as editor, and still passionately believed that the Stratford Herald would be the last paper standing, whatever was going on in the rest of the industry. And that's why I still celebrate the fact that Stratford is an exceptional place in so many ways, and broadly supportive, and I believe able to support its newspaper. So I came as editor. I'd been at Banbury Guardian most recently before that, which in many ways I saw as a similar kind of distinctive community. Banbury sort of serves as almost like a little regional capital to that curious mix of North Oxfordshire, the very south of South Warwickshire, and parts of South Northamptonshire. If you look, it's fascinating. We just to do the obvious and look on the map, and Banbury is further north than parts of South Warwickshire. So yes, places like Long Compton are further south than Banbury is, even though Banbury is in Oxfordshire, which is the same county as Henley-on-Thames. It's quite fascinating. But yes, a strong link between the two, but Stratford's still distinctive. So I came back in December 2018. The essential print portfolio was the same as it was in the 1980s. We still had the Herald, we still had the Midweek, we still had Focus magazine, and yes, we had a website, although it wasn't anything that was greatly developed. And my genuine belief was the Herald was here to stay, and that I hoped the experience of working elsewhere I could now really put into effect for the benefit of the Herald and the Stratford community. 2019 was an interesting year in its own right, but obviously if we come to the crunch, then last year was the extraordinary one. Just at the start of last year, we relaunched the Midweek, which was the free paper, and we decided to make that very distinctive from the Herald, because as we analysed, the Herald, like everywhere else, wasn't immune from falling sales, but we felt some people were getting the midweek news and feeling that was enough. They didn't need the Herald because they got the midweek, and we were perhaps undermining our own newspaper sales. So we decided to relaunch the midweek and make it quite different. And then only on about the third or fourth issue of that new look midweek, that was the Monday evening when Boris Johnson stood up and, you know, in one speech, largely closed down the Stratford economy, but also we'd got a lorry load of midweek newspapers on the way back from the printers, and the distribution manager came on the phone to me and said, "Richard, what do I do? You know, we've got these newspapers coming in, and obviously a free newspaper is absolutely dependent on people taking them out, pushing them through people's doors, usually delivered by young people or older people, and on every level we just couldn't send them out." So, you know, that same Monday evening of that key announcement, we also had to put the midweek news 40 odd thousand into a warehouse. A few saw the light of day that news agents were happy to take, but otherwise that one never got seen, and we quickly had to come up with a plan for what to do next. Now, we moved very quickly to working from home. We'd never practiced. We'd got no document to pick up to tell us how to produce a newspaper working from home. But the editorial team in that third week of March last year moved home to work. And I guess the other thing that in my very short time as editor of the Herald is my footnote in history. I also put the case that we should go tabloid with the paper. There've been various attempts or considerations about this over the years. I think it was about Christmas 2013, Chris Towner did a single tabloid issue at Christmas just to sort of dip the toe in the water. But when I was interviewed in 2018, I was told the one thing I couldn't change was that the Herald would be a broadsheet and always would be. But my analysis was that moving into these extraordinary times, we were dealing with a printer that had to reconfigure its press to print the Herald as a broadsheet when everything else it printed was tabloid. So, yeah, it was my belief that in every respect, if staffing was down, let's make it as easy as possible. Let's print as a tabloid. It was agreed, and then the next day I was told, no, we must still be a broadsheet. And I went back with a very long email, and much to my surprise, won the argument, and the Herald went tabloid. And although there is a way that people like to sum up what they think the Herald reader is, I have to say genuinely, I only had one person complain about it not being a tabloid anymore. It was available online as well. So as we all entered that extraordinary period together, what we saw initially was an outpouring of support for the Herald as we tried to connect people who were isolated and locked in their homes. The online version seemed to work for people in its compact form. Just by going tabloid, the fact was we overcame those who always said the Herald was too thin and got many pages in it as a broadsheet, and we came out with something more. And as journalists, we don't expect praise, but we then got this in quite an outpouring of support from Stratford for what we were attempting to do. And I think if you'd surveyed the town, business is likely to get in trouble because of COVID. I think few people would have put the Herald at the top of that list. It had been, been around since 1860, so for all of us, it'd always been there. And yes, we were working incredibly hard. I was working 7 days a week till 11 o'clock. A lot of evenings as people lost what day it was, what time it was. My earliest phone call was 4:15 in the morning. I was getting calls after 10 o'clock on a Saturday evening. But after all that, I was then summoned to a meeting early in May last year to be told that Herald was in administration, which was quite a shock. you know, family owned, and that was all part of its strength. And we were in administration, and then obviously it was about keeping the paper going while we looked for a buyer. The staff, regrettably, was slimmed down. People were furloughed. Subsequently, people were made redundant. But as you know, as we sit here now, the Herald has survived. It's survived as a tabloid and has new owners. A bigger operation, but still at the heart of it, a family operation. So the name, some of you may recognise, that crucially involved is the Iliff family, who have a long connection with newspapers in the area, having been involved with previous incarnations of the Coventry Telegraph and Birmingham Post and Mail. So it's still got that sense of independence from the big shareholder influence groups, as part of a group that's been built up of towns in marketplaces that offer a real prospect. So after an eventful year, I feel the Herald is in good hands. Personally, I stepped down at the start of this year after a year where last year I only had 2 days off, worked those hours described, and my wife, curiously, with a medical situation involving complex balance problems, I decided for the first time at my great age to put family first. So decided it was time for a break, knowing that the Herald had been saved and the Herald was in good hands. Now,